Welcome to Facing the Future, brought to you by the Concord Coalition on WKXL, New Hampshire's talk radio station. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Each week, we take a nonpartisan dive into topics related to the federal budget, the economy, and how it all affects our nation's future. This week, we'll talk with Douglas Elmendorf, professor of public policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, former dean of the Kennedy School, and former director of the U.S. Congressional Budget Office from 2009 to 2015. Elmendorf has also been a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, assistant director of the Division of Research and Statistics at the Federal Reserve Board, and deputy assistant secretary for economic policy at the U.S. Treasury Department, and senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. My goodness, is there any is there any position you haven't held?
Some people think I had trouble keeping a job, Bob.
Yeah, that's
Depends how you look at it.
Yeah, well, anyway, Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux joins the conversation. Doug, welcome back to Facing the Future.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be here and to be here with you and with Carolyn.
Well, listen, there's not much going on. I mean, the fiscal year just ended September 30th. We had another deficit of close to $2 trillion. 1.8 trillion to be precise, and to celebrate, the government is shut down because they can't agree on appropriations for next year. And the Federal Reserve is going to be meeting later this month at the end of October with some mixed signals. A very complicated picture facing the Fed because you've got apparently a falling jobs market. We're not quite sure because of the federal shutdown. We're not getting the data that we usually get, but it also looks like inflation, and we're not getting the data on inflation that we need in real time. But inflation is still a little bit higher than the Fed would like. So they've got a dilemma, and there are lots of legal questions about some of the president's actions on spending and taxes. And so anyway, a little boring stuff. So let me just toss it out just to get us started here. What's your take on kind of where we are right now, on where the economy is right now, and then we'll move over to the fiscal picture.
Well, the economy is, in some ways, very strong. We have an unemployment rate that is low by historical standards. We've had economic growth since the pandemic that is faster than economic growth rates in many other advanced economies. So there's a lot of good news. But there's also worrying news for sure. The inflation rate is running well above the Federal Reserve's target and really stopped coming down more than a year ago. There are reasons to think it would continue down, except that we now have tariffs that are pushing inflation up. And the labor market seems weaker. The growth of jobs is way down. The unemployment rate hasn't really gone up very much yet. And that's because it seems that the supply of workers is slowing along with the demand for workers. And our new immigration policy is probably playing an important role in that. So the Federal Reserve indeed has a challenge. If it looked only at the inflation data, it would be inclined to hold interest rates or even raise them. If it looks only at the labor market data, it would be inclined to cut interest rates. And of course, it can't both raise and cut at the same time. And so it will have to make a hard choice again this month and presumably in December and beyond as well.
Does it seem to you that they might just hold while they get more data? I mean, just not, they don't have to cut or raise.
They could just pause. I think they are ruining the lack of data, but I don't think that will hold their hand. There are other ways to learn what's happening in the economy, not as good ways. It is a real problem for the public sector decision makers like the Fed and for private sector decision makers, businesses, households, to not know what's happening in the economy. It's very costly, but I think the Fed will nonetheless make their best assessment about the balance of risks and act accordingly. It might be a pause anyway, but I don't think it will be a pause specifically because of the lack of data.
And one more question before I bring Carolyn into the conversation here. You mentioned tariffs, and that's part of the uncertainty for a couple of reasons. One, they come and go with great rapidity, and you're not really sure. And then the other one is you're not really sure what actions will be taken in response to the tariffs, whether it be from other countries or how companies deal with the tariffs, whether to eat some of the costs themselves or pass it off to consumers. Do you think there's a delayed reaction there? I mean, for inflation on the tariffs?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think the uncertainty about tariff policy that you highlight, both our tariff policy and the tariff policies of our trading partners, is a real challenge for businesses to navigate. I think it justifies slowing up of investment in plant and equipment, justifies a slowing up in hiring, and justifies a reluctance to pass through cost increases to consumers right away. I doubt that will last, though. I think it's likely over time that as policy settles down, which presumably it will in some way, that businesses will have a clearer sense about the net change in their costs and about the competitive marketplace they're in, and that we'll see more pass through of tariffs into consumer prices, which is what we've tended to see in the past.
Carolyn.
Well, I guess we've got the economy. The other big thing on everybody's minds these days is the shutdown. And you have the Republicans trying to pass a continuing resolution to extend funding for the government for a little bit longer so they can hammer out a long-term alternative. Democrats are saying that they want to roll in the premium tax credits into this discussion. And there are also some things, I think, subtext about budget process and whether they can cut a deal with people and whether the president would honor that deal, given that the president and the administration has really, just made cuts, impoundments, things like that, that violate certainly our tradition and potentially the law around the budget. Let's start at the top of that, which is, do shutdowns matter? And that is a question that comes up a lot. Do you think they matter? Do they have does it make a difference that we're shut down? A lot of people are like, we're not feeling it. We don't care. So what?
Oh,
let it shut down.
Oh, so shutdowns matter a lot. And I think that our policymakers are doing the nation bad service by not recognizing how costly shutdowns are. Some of the cost is to the economy. When workers don't get paid, then they can't spend money. And that slows the economy at a somewhat perilous time. But I think the bigger issues are actually the disruption to the provision of government services. The people who are working for the government are doing work all the time. And when they can't do that work, then ultimately that will turn out to be a delay or a loss of government services. Moreover, it is so harmful to an organization to have a large set of its people not at work for some indeterminate period of time. When I ran the Congressional Budget Office, there was a shutdown of a few weeks. And the planning we did for that and what we did during it and how we brought people back to work later was a big distraction from the work that Congress was actually paying us at the Congressional Budget Office to do. And so I think it is very damaging to the workings of a big, complicated organization. And I don't feel like our policymakers take that disruption as seriously as I wish they would.
So on that as well, one of the things we point out at Concord is that the Congress really has not passed a full budget on time since 1996. And I spent a lot of my time in the trenches with state budgets. And the Congress and our US government tends to run on these repeated continuing resolutions. Sometimes they'll extend 6 months into the year. So they're never really passing a full budget. And you're director of the Congressional Budget Office, not only seeing it for your own operations, but for federal agencies at large. What are the costs of running a massive operation, running the greatest nation on earth with that kind of budget process?
Wasted energy, missed opportunities. People sometimes say the government should run like a business. I don't think that's quite right. There are a lot of ways in which the public sector differs from the private sector. But one of the ways in which the public and private sectors are alike is that to do a good job, you want a coherent plan that you can stick with for some period of time, make adaptations where you need to, but do that in a thoughtful way. And that's not the way we run the US government. And it's really, I think we're fortunate as citizens of the country, the government runs as well as it does, given the wasted energy. And we'd be better off if we could make real plans. At the very least, it would be nice to have appropriations to run the government for a fiscal year known at the beginning of that fiscal year. Of course, and we'll talk about the broader imperative to put US fiscal policy on a sustainable long-run path. But even if that's too hard, you would think that we could at least be ready to open the government for business on October 1st every year, and knowing what the spending will be like, agency by agency, over the coming 12 months. And we have not done that in a long, long time.
Just coming out of the state, it's just like, how can this not happen, right? At the state, they walk in, legislature walks in, they're like, our one job is to get the budget done, and they tackle it and just do it. And so it's really very frustrating to see how
Doug,
it works.
you have students from overseas. Do they understand the government shutdown here in the U.S.?
No, they're mostly quite puzzled. I've been teaching this week and last week, and it's come up in class. And I have students from other countries who will say, well, in my country, this could never happen. We always settle things out, or there's a default way in which the government operates until things can be worked out. And they come from a range of countries, and not countries that we would normally think of as superior to the United States and their ability to be organized or run things, or they don't have longer histories of doing this than we do. We have a particular shortcoming in this way.
Yeah, and you hear in some like parliamentary systems where if the budget fails, the government falls. I mean, it's just
Yes, I just didn't mention that.
Yeah.
I mean, parliamentary systems are different.
Yeah,
and
right.
we deliberately chose in this country to have a different sort of system. Although, of course, part of the point of the different sort of system was to have checks and balances by having branches of government that would be in contention. And we haven't seen the benefits of that so much in recent years either, as the Congress, I think, has become more willing to do what the president wants. And that,
well, we'll get to that on the other side of the break. We're going to have to take our first break here. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeau and I are talking with Doug Elmendorf. He's former director of the Congressional Budget Office and former dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He's still teaching there. And we'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeau and I are talking with Professor Douglas Elmendorf of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's the former dean there at the Kennedy School, and he is relevant to this conversation, the former director of the Congressional Budget Office. Before we took the break, we were talking a little bit about the power of the purse and how it's used or not used. It's really become quite an issue in this administration because President Trump and his budget director, Russell Vought, have a very aggressive view of the president's expansive view, I should say, of the president's control over spending. And it's really playing out in this shutdown situation, because with the government shutdown, the president is proposing transferring funds around to pay for things like the military pay or the Women and Infant Children's Program, WIC. He's talked about using unused tariff revenues, which doesn't make sense to me. I'm going to have that explained, because it's really, the problem is if you don't have an appropriation, then the Anti-Deficiency Act says you can't spend the money. It doesn't matter if you have the money coming in. You need Congress to designate it for that purpose. But anyway, I just wanted to get your impression. It's not really CBO's call. I think it's maybe more of a GAO thing, but what about this, the power of the purse issues here, and it's kind of the lack of congressional pushback on the administration's aggressive use of executive branch authority?
Yeah, well, I'm not a lawyer, Bob, as you know, and so I can't really speak to the legalities. But I know from my own time working for the Congress that Congress has traditionally guarded its power over the purse taking that very seriously. When I was being interviewed to be director of CBO, one of the questions that I got in the interview process was whether I understood that my job would be to work for the Congress and not to be dealing with members of the executive branch. And that question came as much from the Democrats with a Democratic president at the time as it did from Republicans. And people would say, in all seriousness to me, remember that the US Congress is in Article 1 of the Constitution. So I am frankly shocked that the Congress has not stood up this year more to protect its prerogatives vis-a-vis the president. Again, independent of the specific policy issues, just the role of the Congress is something that the people I work for in Congress fought for and took seriously. And I don't see that now. That makes a lot of things harder. And in particular, if the Republicans in the White House and the Congress want the Democrats in Congress to sign on the spending levels for next year, it would be useful if the Republicans in the executive branch weren't simultaneously giving little heed to the spending levels that the Democrats, Republicans in Congress had voted for previously. So I think this is a long-term problem in terms of the balance of powers in our government, and a specific short-term problem in terms of getting this appropriations problem worked out.
Carolyn, a question for Doug, and I also sort of have a question for you. As a former member of Congress, what as a former guardian of the congressional power of the purse, how does this strike you?
Yeah, it's very surprising. I don't understand why they're letting this go in this way, and they're going to pay a price for it. On the other, right now, Russell Vought, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and the president, they're very carefully picking programs that are politically, like women, infant, and children's food program or military pay, that Congress doesn't want to interfere with, right? If he's going to move money illegally, but they want those programs funded. But there's going to come a time when that does not happen. And then where are they going to be? You know, what leverage are they going to have if they've let this power go? And I just don't think they're thinking about it that way right now. And that's going to be a problem down the line. Do you have more you want to ask on the process?
Go ahead.
I was going to switch around. I was going to, because Doug has got some great insight into the economic effect of the debt and the deficit, and wanted to get to some of those issues as well as these institutional ones. So one of the questions we ask a lot of people on Facing the Future is, what happens if we just keep going the way we're going on the debt and deficit? You know, the deficit is growing, the debt is growing, and Congress really seems to have no will whatsoever to try to tackle this issue. Okay, so what if we don't tackle it, and we just keep letting that gap, the deficit, widen and add to the debt?
Well, eventually we would end up in a fiscal crisis. Fiscal crisis is what happens when investors are unwilling to buy and hold government securities, government bonds at typical interest rates. They get worried they're not going to get paid back or receive the interest they're owed. So they start charging higher interest rates, and then higher rates make an already unsustainable budget situation even more unsustainable by pushing deficits and debt up. And that makes investors more worried. And you end up in a situation where the government really has to make dramatic changes in spending and taxes, or tries to inflate the debt away, or defaults on the debt. And all those outcomes are bad, damaging for the people of the country. So you don't want to get to that point of fiscal crisis. Now, one of the challenges is that economists cannot predict when that kind of crisis will occur. And I think there have been some times in the past when some people have said, oh, it's right around the corner, we're on the edge of the cliff, in a way that couldn't really be defended with evidence. And then it turned out we weren't so close to the edge of the cliff. So we have to be very careful in this line of work not to be crying wolf. But that doesn't mean that we can get away with this forever. You can't just have debt continuing to rise and have interest payments continuing to rise, because it's going to come from somewhere, ultimately. So I think the real problem here is that we just don't know when that's going to happen. And therefore, in any given moment, we might well be more likely to muddle through. But at some point, that won't happen, and it won't be possible anymore. And so the right thing to do, the prudent thing to do, of course, is to take action first. You don't wait until you're sure you're on the edge of the cliff, to step back. And we should be stepping back yesterday. Would be better than today, and today would be better than tomorrow, and tomorrow would be better than next year.
Is there anything you see on the horizon that might create sufficient crisis to get Congress to act on this?
Well, I suppose. I think one thing that can happen is that there can be some moment of crisis of confidence that is supported by there being a high level of debt, but isn't because debt has reached some particular numerical value. It's a combination of high debt and a lack of belief in the good operations of the government. And so in the UK a few years ago, then Prime Minister Liz Truss announced a new budget that would have made the UK government's debt bigger. But beyond that, I think suggested in various ways that her government was not firmly grabbing the wheel on budget issues. And there was a sudden spike upward in British government securities interest rates. And there were some financial complications that fed into that, and rates went up even more. And then the government actually the British government withdrew those plans essentially over the next month or so when Prime Minister Truss stepped down. So there can be wake-up calls of that sort. There also can be some other specific things in the way we run our budget. And the one I have in mind is that there are trust funds out of which we pay Social Security benefits and also Medicare, some parts of Medicare benefits. And the Social Security Trust Fund, there are two of them, but we can stay away from the technicalities. They're going to run out of money in less than a decade. And this is a point that's been long predicted, although the specific year moves around because forecasts are always uncertain. But we've known this was coming. We've known roughly when it's coming, and it's just getting closer. And at that point, some decision will need to be made, or Social Security benefits will fall by roughly a quarter, essentially overnight. And I don't think that would ever be allowed to happen. So that's not an economic crisis, but maybe it would be a political crisis in a way that could spur action. But that's still quite a few years out, a lot of extra debt, a lot can happen between now and then.
Yeah. So you have a great paper, and I'll let Bob explore some of this more with you, but what do we do? And there are two, you know,
and let me say, we've only got about a minute left in this segment.
Oh, okay,
so
okay.
Let me just tee it up by saying that Doug wrote a great paper with Glenn Hubbard, who was he Council of Economic Advisors?
Hubbard was the chair of the CEA for President George W. Bush, and we also wrote with Zach Liskow, who had a senior role in the Biden Office of Management and Budget. And
so this is a thoroughly bipartisan effort on the part of the three of you to ask a very interesting question that we've dealt with from time to time at the Concord Coalition, which is, you know, can you grow your way? Is the deficit unsustainable? Yes. Can we grow our way out of it? And you found probably not under any realistic options. And then you looked at some options that could help grow the economy and might be done so in a way that didn't harm the debt and may actually contribute to it. And the mechanisms for doing that we will get to on the other side of this break. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I are talking to Professor Douglas Elmendorf of the Kennedy School of Government. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I are talking with Douglas Elmendorf. He's former director of the Congressional Budget Office. He is now a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and he is the former dean of the Kennedy School of Government. And we were talking about a paper that you wrote with Glenn Hubbard, and the third author again is
Zach Liskow.
Zach Liskow, and a very bipartisan paper exploring economic growth and the federal budget and the debt and sort of options for dealing with the deficit and the debt by growing the economy, which is certainly a good thing that we would all like to do. But there is no economic growth button in the basement of the Capitol to push. And so people are never quite sure how that's done. So you explored this. So just tell us a little bit about what you were trying to get at, and then we can get at what you found.
Thank you. So when you talk about ways to put the budget on a sustainable path, the two obvious ways are to cut spending and to raise revenue. And I presume we'll ultimately do some of both. You might think of those as just in the direct sense, taking money out of people's pockets directly, taking benefits or services away from them. But that doesn't really do justice to the issues at stake, because there are different ways in which the government's spending and revenue affect growth of the economy. And if you could make changes in policy that would spur economic growth, that would not only be good just for its own sake, as you mentioned, Bob, that would also help narrow the budget imbalance, because a stronger economy generates more tax revenue for any given set of tax rates. That reduces the deficit. And so in this paper, we surveyed 7 areas of economic policy to see what is known about how changes in policies might affect economic growth. And we found that there are a number of areas where different policies would in fact spur economic growth, but how much they would spur it by is not so clear. And the paper was partly a call for people like me to do more research. So when policymakers are making decisions, they have not just a qualitative sense of how some things are good for growth or bad for growth, but a quantitative sense. So they can really have the kind of analysis they need. So one example of this would be for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act this past summer, the Congressional Budget Office did what's called the dynamic analysis, which takes account of all the ways in which that bill could affect the economy. And CBO listed a long set of ways, some of which would be good for economic growth, some of which would be detrimental to economic growth from that bill. And the more we know about those levers, there's no single simple button, but there are a set of levers. The more we know about how moving those levers matters, the better decisions that our elected leaders can make.
And you mentioned dynamic scoring. I mean, this you dealt with that quite a bit at the Congressional Budget Office, and I mean, I know that CBO has done a lot of research in trying to refine the science of dynamic scoring, but from a political point of view, a lot of politicians would take the hope that the policies that they are advocating would be so terrific that they would actually, quote unquote, pay for themselves. Usually that is not the case.
Usually that is not the case. And naturally, proponents of policies like to credit them with great things. And that's why the organizations like CBO are there to say, no, here's what the evidence really shows. What we find is that regulatory policy changes are more likely to pay for themselves, in the sense they don't tend to have direct budgetary costs of any magnitude. And so, for example, if we relaxed some of the restrictions on permitting to build power lines or other sorts of infrastructure, that would spur economic growth, that would reduce budget deficits to some extent, and there wouldn't be much direct budgetary costs. Now, there could be other trade-offs. I want to be clear here. Those permitting requirements were put in place to protect the environment, to protect people who would be affected by infrastructure. So it's not a free lunch, but you could do, on a budgetary sense, it's good for the economy without doing harm to the budget. You can think about housing regulation as another example. We have a housing crisis in this country. There are not enough places to live for all the people who are in the country. And that crisis has emerged in significant part because a lot of well-intentioned local policies make it hard to build housing. And relaxing those policies would encourage more housing to be built. Again, at some cost. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our city council just adopted a new policy in which it's easier to build taller apartment buildings. So I, like many people, would rather that not happen on my street. But I support the change in policy. But I think overall, for Cambridge, for the Boston area, it is essential we provide more housing. And it's too bad that happens to come out of my sunlight, but that's what we need to do. But that's a way in which you could spur economic growth, again, without a direct budgetary cost.
Carolyn.
What were some of the other policy levers that you looked at? I know there was immigration was one that can help grow the economy without net positive in essence for us to some degree in terms of the impact on the deficit. Lesser impact on the deficit would help grow the economy.
Yeah, so immigration is obviously a very important policy issue. And I think there are different aspects that get tangled up together. One is the difference between immigration that is not consistent with our laws. The other is immigration that follows our legally prescribed methods of entry. And then within those people who come legally, there are questions about why those people have been allowed in rather than others. The particular focus we gave in this paper was to legal immigration of high-skilled people. These are what are called H-1B visa recipients. They're quite limited in number. And there's good evidence that some fraction of them, not a very large fraction, but some fraction of them will become important inventors and entrepreneurs. And that that generation of ideas and implementation of ideas would be good for the economy overall. And in fact, it'd be good for incomes of people lower in the income distribution, because we would have a more thriving economy. And that's an important question. There are other important questions about other aspects of immigration that we didn't go into in the paper. We talked about tax policy in the paper, tax policy that encourages research and development, or government spending for research and development. That's pretty powerful. And in fact, CBO did an analysis a few months ago of the effects of increased R&D spending, in which they think that actually would pay for itself, which is surprising in some ways, because most policies don't. But R&D has a very strong effect on economic growth in the research evidence. We also talked about policies that provide benefits to poor families. There's a growing body of evidence over the last 10 or 15 years that benefits given to poor families help the children in those families earn more when they enter the labor market years later. Not every study shows this, not every program probably has this effect, but a number of programs do seem to have this effect. So helping those poor families is both a humanitarian gift at the moment and a true economic investment. Whether it pays for itself, I don't know, but it can be both good for broadening economic opportunity and raising growth, and maybe at less budgetary cost, at least, than it looks at first glance.
It's an important thing to think about. So, Bob, back to you.
Okay, well, you mentioned H-1B visas. Now, there's we talked about a proposal that the administration had to impose $100,000 fees on those. We talked to Teresa Cardinal Brown from the Bipartisan Policy Center just after that proposal was made. Do you think that would, is that an anti-growth proposal?
Yes, I think it is anti-growth. Of course, we have to raise revenue some way. So, and most of the ways of raising revenue discourage some things we would like. Not always, all right? If we actually imposed a tax on carbon emissions, that would be discouraging something that we want less of. But most taxes are on work or saving, or immigration of high-skilled people, if that changes. And those discourage things that we like. And so you're looking for the least distorting ways of raising revenue. And I worry that discouraging immigration of high-skilled people, legal immigration by high-skilled people, is maybe a particularly damaging way to raise revenue, because those people can bring such high value to the country. But I haven't studied the details of that.
Right. Yeah, I know. And I'm not really sure what the implementation is going to be there, but CBO has been, going. I don't mean to say being inconsistent, but the projections of immigration have had a lot to do with their economic projections going forward, because they had a big bump in immigration, whether it was legal or not, and that contributed to a rise in the economic projections. And then they had to revise them downward, and we'll see in January they may revise downward again.
Yes, I mean legal, as you say, legal or illegal immigration that brings people to this country tends to be good for the federal budget because those people mostly work and pay tax. In fact, it's less the case for state and local governments that are more responsible for education, and they can end up with more children to educate. So this is complicated. But the surge of immigration a few years ago pushed up government revenue, and the new policies are pushing that down again, as you say, and slowing the economy. Part of what the Federal Reserve is wrestling with is that very slow growth of jobs, maybe because firms don't want to hire people. That's a worrying sign. But may also be because we don't have the numbers of people in the country. The labor force is not growing the way it used to. And both those factors are probably at work together. But the Fed needs to separate those out. With low immigration and with the low fertility rates we now have in this country, the population and the labor force are going to grow very, very slowly. And that's going to lower the steady state growth of the economy, which is part of why thinking about ways to boost productivity through research and development or other things is even more important.
You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and Carolyn Bordeaux, Executive Director of the Concord Coalition, and I are talking with Professor Doug Elmendorf of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm here with Carolyn Bordeaux, the Executive Director of the Concord Coalition, and we're talking with Professor Douglas Elmendorf. He is the former director of the Congressional Budget Office, former dean of the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and still is teaching public policy there. We were talking about a great paper that you wrote about economic growth policies that might help the budget deficit. And one of the areas that you did not specifically did not include in that economic growth paper were options around healthcare. And because it was, I guess, too big or beyond the scope of the paper. It's so I wanted to go there now because going back to your time at CBO, you were the CBO director during the time that the Affordable Care Act was being debated and enacted. And I think you were probably inundated with requests for scoring and probably being badgered by both sides about how you made those determinations. And of course, now, several years later, here we are debating the Affordable Care Act is still at the center of the current government shutdown over subsidized premiums. So I wanted to sort of get your take on the importance of healthcare, not as a societal thing, because we can all accept that, but I mean, just for the budget and the economy, how central that is.
Yeah, so the United States has had for decades two main problems in our healthcare system. One is that a lot of people do not have regular access to healthcare because they don't have health insurance. And the other is that healthcare costs are always high and rising further. And it's very striking compared to other countries. We spend a lot more on healthcare in this country, and we don't live longer. We don't live as long, in fact, as people in many other advanced countries. And so we don't seem to be getting our money's worth. The Affordable Care Act was designed to address both those problems. It expanded federal subsidies for health insurance, and the number of people in the country without health insurance fell very sharply. It was also designed to explore ways to rein in healthcare spending, both in a sort of brute force way of just reducing payments to providers, but also in terms of experimenting with different ways of organizing and paying for care. So right now, the Republicans are, through this big bill over the summer, rolling back health insurance coverage. So there'll be millions of more people without health insurance next year and beyond than we've had recently. On the cost side, there's a lot of hand-wringing but not a lot of new policy action. I think that's too bad, but it's partly because there isn't a clear menu of actions to take. We seem to do a good job of taking care of people with some very complicated medical conditions who have insurance. We do a bad job of taking care of a lot of people who mostly need to have their blood pressure checked more regularly and to adopt healthier habits and with guidance from physicians and so on. And we don't seem to be able to do much about that. And that's a huge problem because healthcare is a big part of our total national output and income, use of income. And it's a big part of spending by the federal government and by state governments as well.
Are there particular policies you would recommend that policymakers look at to kind of bend or blunt the growth in healthcare costs?
I think we need to do a combination of changes. There's a set of ideas that come out recently from the Niskanen Center folks in Washington about ways to expand the supply of healthcare. For example, letting more students into medical school, letting people who have not become doctors provide more sorts of healthcare that trained nurse practitioners can provide. So there are ways to expand the supply that helps to bring down prices, all else equal. I think there's also the question of the demand, which think about the payments that we make from the government or from private insurance for care. And there are ways to restructure those that would reward better care rather than rewarding more services in the sort of volume of procedures and so on. But those have been tried before. I don't want to make it sound like they're sitting there for easy wins. I think those are the directions to go in, but they would require a lot of ongoing policymaker work and a lot of ongoing work by people running healthcare systems.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned, healthier habits and that sort of thing is the wellness initiatives are good and we should all do that, but then it does have costs on the other end that people, it's not a free lunch. I mean, people are going to die of something at some point anyway. So I'm not saying you don't do it. I'm just saying it doesn't necessarily save money.
So yes, so there's a temptation to think that preventive care saves money, but even if it does in the end for a person, if the government started paying for all sorts of preventive care, that might actually raise the government's costs on net. So right now I pay for my trainer, I pay for my dental floss and dental visits, I pay for various things. And if the government took over all of that, that would be nice for me. Wouldn't save the government money. But I will say it helps that I have health insurance and I can see a doctor and a dentist regularly, and they can say, listen, Elmendorf, like you should be seeing the trainer more often. So I think habits can be are easier to stick with if one has regular access to healthcare providers that are encouraging that and calling you out when you're slipping.
Well, that's rational behavior. Carolyn, I think you might want to end on some irrational behavior to talk about.
Okay. All right. Well, one of the things we were talking about during the break is how I've been talking to members of Congress, my former colleagues, about sort of what their plan is around the debt and deficit. And I'm hearing a lot of them talking about what's called a break glass scenario, which is we have hit the crisis and then what? Which I find horrifying because there are a lot of bad, really tough decisions that have to be made. But you mentioned you were just at a MIT economic forum, and that issue came up, and was hoping you could talk a little about what you heard there.
Well, I think that break glass plans are useful because we might actually need one, and also because the act of putting one together illustrates how much one would rather not be in that position. And so I think it can have a useful warning effect. The discussion at this conference was basically if you're riding a bicycle downhill and you see a brick wall at the bottom, what do? Do you if you can't steer so well, do you wait till you get there, or do you try to jump off now on the grounds the injury is a little less at our current speed? I don't think we reached a very clear answer there. Part of the complication is that the growing debt is a fundamental challenge for the economy, but also there can be some problems that develop in the markets for debt securities, what's called the plumbing of the financial system. And problems that kind of with plumbing are problems that the Federal Reserve in this country and central banks in other countries generally step in to try to address. And that's probably a good thing to do, but also it does mean then that you end up building up more debt. You get through that little crisis and maybe ride the bicycle downhill further, but you can run into a bigger crisis. I don't think any active policymaker can really say we're going to live with a little crisis if that's avoidable. So I do think ultimately this comes down to our elected representatives taking seriously the coming problems. And we can all help with that. And we as citizens of the country, I think policymakers will be more concerned when people express more concern to them, meaning not just general worry, but a willingness to take some hard medicine to avoid the problems.
Do I have a minute or two here left, Bob?
Yes, you have a
Okay.
minute,
Well,
yes.
I just wanted to ask one more thing that is interesting, and if you could talk a little about. A lot of folks talk about what the Federal Reserve could do, what some of those maneuvers are. Could you talk a little bit about that, right? So not all of this has to be Congress. There's a lot of discussion about what the Federal Reserve could do to sort of cushion the blow.
Yeah, so ultimately the Federal Reserve can't solve this problem. It is a part of the government. And ultimately, if revenues are well short of our spending, that creates an unsustainable run-up in interest payments and has to be addressed. The Federal Reserve could only really help that in the end by printing money in the way that some central banks in other countries have. That produces hyperinflation, which is terribly damaging. What the Fed can do more constructively is to make sure that the plumbing of the financial system works so that the debt that is being bought and sold does so smoothly without there being sudden hangups just in the mechanics. Every year, the federal government will be selling trillions of dollars of debt, partly to replace existing debt that comes to maturity and partly because of ongoing deficits. So the mechanics of that, the Fed can make a big difference in navigating, and I think that's important for them to do. But in the long run, there's no monetary trick to get us out of the fundamental imbalance. We are expecting more benefits and services from the federal government than we are willing to pay for, and there's no way around that except to change.
Very well said, and typical of a CBO, former CBO director. Before we go, we've only got about a minute left, but speaking of CBO, sometimes it comes under criticism. It did in the past year on its scoring of the Big Beautiful Bill Act. Former director of the CBO, what's your take on the agency?
Policymakers are often frustrated by their inability to enact the policies they want, and CBO is a convenient place to assign blame, but it's not CBO's fault. Policymaking is hard, and CBO has continued to provide outstanding service to the Congress and the public by bringing skilled analysis with no partisan leaning to bear. And I think members of Congress ultimately understand that and respect that and appreciate that.
Well, that's certainly been my experience as a consumer of CBO reports. So I think it was terrific. It was particularly it was very good under your watch, and it was before and has been since. You've been listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I have been talking with Professor Douglas Elmendorf of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, former Dean of the Kennedy School, and former Director of the Congressional Budget Office. I'll be back next week with another edition of Facing the Future.